All the way from the start, I can feel it in my heart, like all the way from the start.
Hey, what's going on out there? I'm Sean Devine. Hope you all are doing well. Today's video, we are going to talk about 7 tips for mixing drums that knock. I've got some things to consider here. Let's go ahead and dive right in. I'm going to play a new beat, and it has some really hard drums in it. So this will be hopefully a good example for you guys. All right, so you get the idea here. Let's go ahead and dive into number 1 on my list of tips for mixing drums that knock. Compression and bus compression is not always your friend, especially when it comes to drums. A lot of you have this perspective out there that you have to compress your drums and that you have to utilize, bus compression. I think because, it's just been common practice, especially in some of the more, acoustic drum oriented genres like rock, where you're miking up a drum kit. Bus compression and compression for those individual drum sounds is much more prevalent and much more important versus nowadays, if we're using a lot of these modern samples that have already been compressed, they've already been processed. If you're going to then compress them again or send all those compressed sounds to a bus compressor, then you're just going to kind of control the transients. You're going to tame a lot of the dynamics and transients that are already in those punchy, impactful samples, and we don't want to necessarily do that. Picking the right samples, I can't emphasize this enough. You've heard me talk about, if you start with weak samples, you're just going to be, kind of diving down the rabbit hole, trying to do a lot of mixing processes to get the sound where it needs to be, or maybe close to where it needs to be. But ultimately, if you just pick the right sample, it's a lot less work, and you're also going to be able to more closely match the aesthetic of the rest of the instrumentation and the music in your song, which is the ultimate goal. You want to pick cool drum samples, but you also want to pick samples that really fit in terms of, just contextually and sonically for the song. And once you do that, again, it just makes it a lot easier task to go in here and get them to knock really well. So whether you're utilizing something like Splice or Loop Cloud to download new samples, or you're trading samples with other producers, or if you're building your own drum kits, you're processing sounds, make sure that you're organizing them. That's a really big part of picking the right drum sounds, is knowing what you have and kind of having some go-tos for different situations. Going along with selecting the right samples for mix engineers or producers, don't be afraid to utilize drum replacement. So actually, as a mix engineer, I do drum replacement more than you would think. I will get sessions a lot of times where, the kick or the snare is just not hitting the way that it needs to be. And rather than spend an hour or 2 hours, sitting there and finally EQing and compressing a kick drum, I will just replace it and put a sample that I know is going to be a lot closer to where I need it to be. And then, I can do the minimal process. And we talked about, and even in this session, Jerd had sent me his original kick. And again, rather than go through all that, I just utilized the sample replacement in Logic, which it's very easy. You can just select the audio track, go up here to track, replace or double drum track, and then you can select another sample. In this case, I utilize battery and just loaded up the sample that I wanted there. Very easy to do, and saves you a lot of time. Utilize a maximizer or a brick wall limiter of some sort, and there's 2 options really. You can utilize it on the track itself, so whether it's the actual kick or the snare, depending upon how you're mixing. In this case, I utilized it on the master bus, so I have an L2 Ultra Maximizer, and this is just maximizing really my whole mix. And so, just as a result, it is also bringing those drums up and bringing out a lot of the impact and the transients in them. I'm also utilizing IM Pusher, the clip mode, to give us some of that push and some of that impact also. But utilizing a maximizer is just going to allow you to get the most out of the samples you're using, and specifically in the genres that we're working with these days and the types of drums that we're creating. We want to utilize that maximizer to really pump up the levels, but to also do it in a way that's very transparent. So I do want to just note, as I always do, that no limiter is made equally, and especially in terms of getting drums that knock hard, you want to be very mindful of the limiter or the maximizer that you're using. You're going to find that some of the maximizers and limiters have more of a compressed, glued sound, and that's just not really what we're looking for with a lot of these drum tones. You want something that's very transparent and something that's going to retain the transients and the dynamics. Sidechain compression is definitely something that you want to utilize to get the most out of your drum impact. You'll see that I'm using sidechain compression on the 808. So whenever that kick hits, we've got just a few dB of attenuation there, just so that that kick can punch through even more. I'm also sidechaining some of the instrumentation with the kick drum, which again, this is not as traditional, or I guess common, people, kind of presenting this. But for instance, with the guitars, these are really heavy guitars. Obviously, guitars eat up a lot of room in the mix. So in order to make sure that the kick is being able to punch through and we're getting that tone out of it, I'm also sidechain compressing those. So if we go here, so again, very subtle, not heavy pumping kind of compression, but just that little bit of gain reduction when the kick comes through is going to make sure that we're getting the tone we want out of those drums. Fifth tip I have for you for mixing drums that knock is to select the right EQ. So a lot of you out there are just using, channel EQs or stock EQs on your drums, which if you're getting the sound you want, that's great. But I'm just really picky when it comes to the drum tones, and I just kind of know which EQs are going to get the results I want. And so in the instance of, getting kicks that hit really hard and even processing the snare drum as well, I like to use the PuigTech EQP1A from Waves. You can find a lot of other versions of this out there. They're all built very similarly, and you're going to see that the low frequency control has got a 20 hertz, 30 hertz, and 60 hertz notch. And these are crucial when it comes to getting kicks that hit really hard and poke through the mix. I've just found if you dial these in, boost it a little bit, you're going to get what you want down under with this EQ. And then you can also, use the attenuation to get some really unique curves versus, just a traditional channel EQ or stock EQ plugin. Snare drums, I really like to use the SSL EQ or the SSL channel. You can see I'm doing some very aggressive boosting to some of the mids, high mids here. And then I also like to use the filters on snares just to get rid of a lot of that. And once again, the SSL EQs just have unique curves to them. They're very musical, and they just cater themselves really well, once again, to the snare drum. Next tip I have for you is less is more when it comes to reverb in terms of mixing drums. So people tend to just get carried away with the amount of reverb they're putting on their drum sounds. And what that's going to do is when you put a traditional hall or, like a big space onto your drums, and then you have, a really heavy mix, it's going to give the listener the perspective that the drum is further back in the entire balance, right? So we don't want to do that. You can utilize things like pre-delay, but what I like to do is just use very small spaces, small decay times, and very subtle amounts of wetness. So for instance, if we just solo this snare, I'm going to let y'all just hear that snare dry, because with the SSL EQ and then also the smack attack, which another tip, we'll just throw this in there, is to utilize transient processing. I like smack attack, but let's just turn all those plugins off so you can hear the snare tone. So that's what Jerd sent me. And then with the processing and the reverb. So that reverb is very subtle. And in the context of the mix, you know, you're not hearing this big washy tone to it. I know that it's easy to, you know, put reverb on even a hi-hat and be like, oh man, it sounds better. But you're going to notice, especially when you start referencing your mix on outside systems, I find when I hear drums on a phone or a small speaker and there's too much reverb on them, it will make the drums sound, you know, more washy and just weaker in terms of playing back on those smaller systems. So just be careful with that. All right, so the final tip I have for you for mixing drums that knock is to be aware of the balancing and the levels of your drum tracks. So what I mean by this is a lot of you just feel like, oh, well, if I want the kick and the 808 to be, you know, really loud and hit hard, I need to just crank them up and turn them up super loud. That is a recipe to get distortion. It's a recipe to wreck the rest of the dynamics of your mix. And it's actually going to do the opposite. That 808 and kick, if you do the levels and balancing recklessly, it's going to make your mix not as punchy. You know, I always stress focusing on the core essential balancing, especially to start with in a mix. And so if you want to get drums that knock, you want to make sure that you're making those a focal point. They don't necessarily have to be, you know, excessively loud. You just want them to be more of a focal point than some of the other elements in the mix. It's all about a balance, right? So you want to create room for them as well. You can see, you know, a lot of the EQing I'm doing is to carve out the low end, to carve out, you know, some of the high end so that the kick and the snare can really poke through. But you want to create that space by controlling the balance of the rest of the instrumentation that's around the drums, and then you direct the listener's attention to the fact that your drums are smacking super hard. If you've made it this far in the video, I'm just going to mention another little, you know, secret sauce sort of plugin that a lot of producers use on their kick drums. It gives it a signature crunch and fatness. So let me just solo the kick. It's Sausage Fattener by Dada Life or Data Life. So this is without. Pretty good. Get that extra little bit of crunch, and I'm not even, you know, touching really anything. I'm just clipping it just a bit to get that tone out of it. So a cool plugin to use on your drums. All right, guys, so I hope these tips help you get the drum sound that you're after, get more impactful drums that are going to cut through the mix and really knock properly. If you have any questions about the tips we covered in the video or any of the plugins, feel free to leave a comment below. Hit that notification bell so that you know when new videos are going up. I appreciate y'all. If you learn anything in the video, please like, subscribe, and consider sharing. We'll talk to you soon.